Welcome to Ripper's Nighttime Tales, a chilling series of bedtime horror stories narrated by the horror streamer Mr. Rippers with soft rain and thunder. Drift off to multiple scary tales perfect for late night listening on rumble.com. Do hit that like button and consider following the channel. Leave a comment letting me know where and when you listen. Let's build a community. Okay, let's get started. The 13th Hour, the neon sign of Miller's Gas and Go buzzed with the frantic, dying energy of a trapped insect, the crimson letter G flickering in a seizure of failing electricity that cast a rhythmic, bloody pulse across the wet asphalt. It was a humid, suffocating night in rural Vermont, October 1986. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the distinct, metallic tang of an approaching storm. Inside the station, the air was stale, recycled through a vent clogged with years of dust and grease, smelling of burnt coffee and menthol cigarettes. Old Man Miller sat behind the counter, his skin the texture of crumpled parchment, eyes milky with cataracts and years of staring into the dark abyss of the tree line across the road. He wiped a rag across the linoleum counter, smearing a ring of oil rather than cleaning it. The bell above the door jingled a sharp, brassy intrusion into the silence. A man in a beige trench coat, looking every bit the weary traveler with road-weary eyes and a map clutched in a white-knuckled grip, stepped inside. He wanted directions to the old logging road, the shortcut that sliced through the heart of the Black Hollow woods. Miller stopped wiping his hand, spotted with liver marks and trembling slightly, came to rest on the rosary beads piled next to the cash register. He told the traveler the story, his voice a gravelly rasp that sounded like tires crunching on gravel. He spoke of the 13th hour, the minute past midnight on Friday the 13th, a pocket of time that didn't belong to God, but to the things that festered in the soil of Black Hollow. He spoke of the camp that had burned and drowned, of the silence that wasn't really silence. The traveler laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. He called it a quaint, local ghost story. A tourist trap without the tourists. He bought a pack of gum, threw a crumpled dollar on the oil-smeared counter, and walked out. Miller watched him go. He watched the traveler's taillights fade into the encroaching fog that rolled off the mountains like a slow-motion avalanche. The old man didn't count the money. He just gripped the plastic beads of his rosary until his knuckles turned white, whispering a prayer that was swallowed by the buzzing of the neon sign. 10 minutes later, the sound of a screeching engine and the sickening crunch of metal wrapping around ancient oak echoed from the valley below, followed immediately by a silence so profound it felt heavy. Miller didn't call the sheriff. There was no point. The fog had claimed its toll. 3 hours later, a beat-up 1978 Ford Econoline van, painted a shade of blue that attempted to hide the rust eating away at its wheel wells, rumbled past the gas station. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hairspray, cheap cologne, and a bag of fast food burgers that had gone cold miles ago. Synth pop blasted from the crackling speakers, a driving electronic rhythm that warred with the groan of the van's suspension. Mark was behind the wheel, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, his varsity jacket intentionally unbuttoned to show off the band t-shirt underneath. He was the director, the visionary, or so he told anyone who would listen. In the passenger seat sat Kevin, a nervous bundle of energy, clutching a heavy Panasonic VHS camcorder like it was a holy relic. Kevin adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses, checking the battery levels for the 10th time in as many minutes. In the back, sprawled on the shag carpet Mark had installed himself, were Brad, Jessica, and Raven. Brad was the quintessential linebacker, all broad shoulders and jawline, currently trying to feed a French fry to Jessica, who giggled and pushed his hand away. Jessica was the picture of 1986 innocence, pastel sweater, scrunchy holding back blonde curls, eyes bright with a thrill that hadn't yet turned to terror. And then there was Raven. She sat apart from the others, tucked into the corner near the spare tire. Her black hair was teased into a chaotic halo, her eyeliner thick and dark. She wasn't eating. She was running her thumb over the edge of a tarot card, the tower, its image of destruction barely visible in the passing shadows of the streetlights. They were headed to Black Hollow Camp. The locals called it a grave, Mark called it a film set. They were going to make a mockumentary, a debunking of the myths that kept the town in a chokehold of superstition. They were going to prove that the Friday the 13th curse was nothing more than campfire nonsense, and they were going to capture it all on magnetic tape. "Cut the music, Mark," Raven said, her voice low but cutting through the synth beats. "We're crossing the town line. You should show some respect." "Respect for what? The boogeyman?" Mark scoffed, turning the volume knob down but not off. Lighten up, Elvira. We're here to make history, not a seance. The energy changes here, Raven muttered, looking out the window. The trees seemed to press closer to the road, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers blocking out the moonlight. Can't you feel it? It's heavy. That's just the humidity, babe, Brad said, squeezing Jessica's shoulder. Don't let her spook you, Jess. It's just trees and dirt. The van lurched as they turned off the paved road onto the gravel track leading to the camp. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating swirling dust motes and the occasional reflective flash of animal eyes that vanished too quickly to identify. The suspension groaned in protest as they hit a pothole, sending the camera into Kevin's ribs. Watch the equipment, Mark barked. That camera costs more than your life, Kev. Sorry, Kevin stammered. Hoisting the heavy device back to his shoulder, he pressed the record button. The viewfinder flickered to life in monochrome, turning the world into a grainy, high-contrast nightmare. We're rolling. Intro. Mark cleared his throat, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror. All right, October 13th, 1986. We are approaching Black Hollow Camp, the site of the infamous 1954 massacre. Legend has it, no one survives the night. We intend to prove otherwise. He flashed a charming, arrogant grin at the camera. The road ended abruptly at a rusted iron gate, chained shut with a padlock the size of a fist. Vines, thick and thorny, had woven themselves through the metal bars, reclaiming the entrance for the forest. Mark killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was deafening. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, it was a held breath, a predator waiting to strike. End of the line, Mark announced, grabbing his flashlight. Grab the gear, we walk from here. They piled out of the van. The air was significantly colder here, a damp chill that seeped through denim jackets and varsity leather. The ground was soft, covered in layers of rotting leaves that squelched under their sneakers. Kevin kept the camera rolling, the whir of the tape mechanism the only constant sound. Brad produced a pair of bolt cutters from the back of the van. With a grunt of exertion and a metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot through the valley, the chain fell away. The gate creaked open, the hinges screaming in rust flake agony. As they walked up the overgrown path, the camp revealed itself in the beam of their flashlights. It was a rotting carcass of a place. The cabins, once cheerful and painted in bright summer colors, were now gray and slumped. Their roofs caved in like broken spines. The mess hall loomed ahead, its windows shattered, the jagged glass looking like teeth in a gaping maw. Nature was digesting Black Hollow. Moss coated every surface in a fuzzy green leprosy. Strange circular carvings marred the bark of the ancient pines, symbols that looked like eyes weeping sap. Zoom in on that, Mark directed, pointing his light at a cabin door hanging off its hinges. Look at that decay, perfect texture. Raven stopped in the center of the clearing. She was looking up, high above the mess hall, in a precarious bell tower that looked ready to collapse. A bronze bell hung silent and dark against the gray sky. That bell, she whispered. The legend says they took it down. After the tragedy. Guess they forgot, Brad said, kicking a rotting soccer ball that had half melted into the mud. No, Raven said, shivering, it wasn't there in the old photos. I checked the archives at the library. Someone put it back. Then, Jessica said, her voice trembling slightly. She moved closer to... Maybe squatters, or maybe, Kevin said, his voice shaking as he filmed the bell. The camp put it back itself. They set up their base of operations in the main lodge, the only building that seemed structurally sound enough to not collapse on their heads. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the air smelled of mildew and something sweeter, more cloying, like flowers left too long on a grave. Mark directed them to set up sleeping bags in a circle, placing the electric lanterns in the center. All right, here's the plan. Mark said, pacing. We split up. Brad, you and Jess take the lakefront. Get some shots of the water, the dock. Kevin and I will check out the cabins. Raven, you do your witchy thing. Stay here, set up the atmosphere. We meet back here at 11:30 to prep for the midnight shot. Splitting up, Kevin squeaked. Have you never seen a movie, Mark? That's how people die. It's how we cover ground. Genius. Go. The groups dispersed into the darkness. Brad and Jessica walked toward the lake, their flashlight cutting a singular lonely beam through the mist that was beginning to rise from the ground. The lake was a black mirror, perfectly still, reflecting nothing but the void above. The dock was rickety, the wood slimy with algae. This place is creepy, Brad, Jessica murmured, hugging herself. Can we just get the shots and go back? Babe, relax, Brad said, wrapping his arms around her. It's just a rundown camp. Mark's trying to scare everyone for the movie. Watch. He picked up a rock and hurled it into the lake. It splashed, sending ripples outward. See, just water, but the ripples didn't stop. They kept going, defying the physics of the impact, growing larger, more violent, until the center of the lake began to bubble. A foul stench rose from the depths, sulfur and rot. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The water went glass smooth again. Did you see that? Jessica gasped, backing away. Gas pocket, Brad said, though his voice lacked conviction. Swamp gas happens all the time. Meanwhile, Mark and Kevin were exploring the counselor's cabin. It was a wreck of overturned furniture and shredded mattresses. In the corner, half buried under a pile of rotting newspapers, lay a leather-bound journal. Mark kicked the debris aside and picked it up. The leather was damp and cold, feeling disturbingly like skin. Jackpot, Mark grinned, flipping it open. Kevin, get a close-up. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. It belonged to Silas Vane, the camp's founder. Mark read aloud, his voice echoing in the cramped space. The soil is hungry. It demands payment. I have given it the livestock, I have given it the stray dogs, but it wants more. The 13th hour approaches. If I do not appease the unlucky dead, the lake will boil red and the bell will toll for us all. This is gold, Mark laughed. The guy was a lunatic, a total psycho. Mark, Kevin said, lowering the camera, look at the date on the last entry. Mark squinted, Friday, August 13th, 1954. The day the camp closed, the day everyone vanished. He tried to do a ritual, Kevin whispered. He tried to stop something, and he failed. Back at the lodge, Raven had arranged her tarot cards on a dusty table. She turned them over, one by one, death. The hanged man, the moon, judgment, and finally in the center, the devil. But the card was wrong. The figure on the card wasn't the goat-headed Baphomet. It looked like a man with a face made of shifting shadows, standing in a lake of blood. The card felt hot to the touch. Raven swept them off the table, her breath hitching. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to elongate, stretching toward her like reaching arms. The group reconvened at the lodge at 11:45 p.m. The mood had shifted, the bravado was gone, replaced by a collective unease that sat in their stomachs like lead. Jessica was pale. Kevin was shaking so hard the camera footage would be unusable. Even Mark looked rattled, though he tried to hide it. Okay, Mark said, checking his watch. 15 minutes to midnight, we go to the chapel. That's where the bell is. We film the countdown, nothing happens. We laugh, we leave. They marched to the chapel, a small A-frame structure beneath the bell tower. The pews were overturned, the altar was covered in dried wax and deep, gouged scratches. Kevin set the camera on a tripod, aiming it at the bell rope that dangled through a hole in the ceiling. The rope was frayed, stained dark at the bottom. 11:58, Mark announced, "Get ready." The wind died. The crickets stopped chirping, the woods went completely terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the mechanical whir of the camcorder and their own ragged breathing. 11:59, Jessica gripped Brad's hand. Raven closed her eyes, muttering a protection spell that felt woefully inadequate. Midnight, Mark said. Nothing happened. A second passed, then 10, then a minute. Mark let out a breathy laugh. See, I told you nothing. It's 12:01. The curse is bull-she-elling. The sound was not heard, it was felt. A shockwave of pure, dissonant vibration that rattled their teeth and brought them to their knees. The bell above tolled, a deep, mournful sound that echoed not just through the valley, but through time itself. Slang, who pulled the rope? Mark screamed, shining his light at the cord. It was swinging wildly, but no one was touching it. Sealang, Kevin screamed, the camera, look at the camera. The viewfinder was no longer showing the chapel. It was showing the room they were in, but it was different. In the grainy black and white screen, the chapel was pristine, lit by hundreds of candles, and the pews were full. They were filled with people, campers, counselors, sitting perfectly still, their heads turned backward at unnatural angles, staring directly at the lens. "Turn it off," Jessica shrieked. "I can't," Kevin yelled, mashing the buttons. It won't stop. The shadows in the corners of the room detached themselves from the walls. They weren't just absences of light anymore. They were three-dimensional, viscous entities oozing across the floor like spilled ink. "Run," Brad roared, grabbing Jessica. They bolted for the door, but the door slammed shut with the force of a hydraulic press. Brad threw his shoulder against it, but it held fast, solid as the mountain itself. The first shadow reached Mark. It didn't strike him, it stepped into him. Mark gasped, his back arching violently. His flashlight dropped, rolling across the floor, the beam spinning wildly. When Mark stood up, his movements were jerky, marionette-like. He turned to face them. His eyes were gone. In their place were pools of black fluid that leaked down his cheeks like tears. "Mark?" Kevin whispered. "Mark is gone." The thing wearing Mark's skin said. The voice was a chorus of whispers, 1,000 dry throats speaking at once. The 13th hour has begun. Mark, or the thing that was Mark-lung? He moved with impossible speed, clearing the distance to Kevin in a blur. He grabbed Kevin by the throat. Kevin gagged, the camera falling from his hands. It hit the floor, lens cracking, but kept recording. The angle was canted, showing only feet and the encroaching darkness. Kevin's feet kicked wildly, then stopped. There was a wet tearing sound like a sheet ripping, followed by a thud. Brad, fueled by pure adrenaline, grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from the floor and swung it at the entity. It connected with a sickening crunch against Mark's skull, but the entity didn't even flinch. It just smiled, a wide, impossible grin that split the face from ear to ear, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that hadn't been there a moment ago. "The window," Raven yelled, grabbing a pew and shoving it through the stained glass. The glass shattered outward. "Go." Brad shoved Jessica through the opening, then Raven. He looked back at his friend, at the ruin of Kevin on the floor. The Mark thing was licking the blood from its fingers. Brad vaulted through the window just as the entity lunged, its claws raking the heel of his boot. They tumbled onto the damp earth outside. The fog had thickened to a soup. Visibility was zero. "To the van," Brad yelled. They ran, but the woods had changed. The path was gone. Trees seemed to have moved, blocking their way, hurting them. The carvings on the trees were glowing now, a faint, sickly phosphorescence. The ground beneath their feet felt soft, spongy like flesh. Jessica tripped, her foot catching on a root. She fell hard. Brad scrambled back to help her up. "Come on, Jess, get up, my ankle," she cried. From the fog, shapes emerged. They weren't just shadows now. They were the campers from the video, pale, waterlogged, their skin sloughing off in gray sheets. They moved with a shambling, relentless gait. They didn't run, they didn't have to. "Go, Brad." "Save yourself?" Jessica screamed as a figure in a rotting counselor's uniform grabbed her ankle. "No." Brad kicked at the figure, his boot connecting with wet mush. He grabbed Jessica and hoisted her up, practically carrying her. They stumbled blindly through the underbrush, thorns tearing at their clothes and skin. They reached the clearing by the lake. The van was there. It looked like a sanctuary, a metal womb of safety, keys. Brad yelled, patting his pockets, "I don't have the keys." Mark had the keys. Raven slammed her fist against the side of the van. "Hot wire it, you know how. I need tools, I need time." The fog parted near the dock. The lake was boiling again, churning violently. From the center of the water, a massive shape rose. It was composed of mud, weeds, and bones. A golem of the lake's refused towered over them, dripping slime. The chapel, Raven gasped, realizing the truth. The journal said he tried to appease the dead. "We have to finish the ritual." "What?" Brad yelled, staring at the mud monster. "The bell." Raven shouted. "The journal said the bell tolls for us all. We have to ring it 13 times manually to end the hour. It's the only way to close the door. We just came from there." Jessica sobbed. "I'll go." Brad said, his face hardening. He looked at Jessica. "Get inside the van, lock the doors, don't open them for anyone but me." "Brad, no, Raven, keep her safe." Brad kissed Jessica quickly, a desperate final press of lips, and then turned and sprinted back into the darkness, back toward the horrors they had just escaped. Raven shoved Jessica into the van through the unlocked back door and scrambled in after her, locking it. They huddled together in the dark interior, listening. Outside, the sounds of the night were a cacophony of violence. Screams, wet thuds, the snapping of wood. The van rocked as something slammed against the side, a face pressed. Against the window, Kevin's face, pale and drained of blood, mouthing the words, "Let me in." "Don't look," Raven whispered, holding Jessica's head against her chest. "It's not him. It's not him." From the distance, the bell tolled. Clang. 1. The creatures outside the van paused. Slang. 2. Brad was doing it. Slang. 3. Raven counted the tolls, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slang. 4. The van shook violently. The mud thing from the lake was here. Metal groaned as the roof began to buckle. Clang! 5 glass shattered. A muddy hand, thick as a tree trunk, reached in, groping blindly. Jessica screamed, scrambling back. Raven grabbed a flare from the emergency kit Mark kept under the seat. She popped the cap and struck it. A blinding red light filled the van. She jammed the burning flare into the muddy hand. The creature roared, a sound like rocks grinding together, and recoiled to Clang. 6 ceiling, 7 slang, 8 silence. Why did he stop? Jessica whispered, maybe he's resting, Raven said, though she knew better. Then a scream. Brad's scream. It was cut short, choked off. No. Jessica lunged for the door. Raven tackled her. You can't help him. If you go out there, you die. He's dying. He's buying us time. Slang. 9 the bell rang again. But the sound was different. Weaker, desperate, slang, 10, slang, elang, 12 silence. Again, the longest silence in the world. The creatures outside were still, waiting. The 13th hour was almost over. One more ring, just one more. They waited, seconds stretched into minutes. The sun would be rising soon. If the bell didn't ring, the door would stay open. The night would never end. I have to go, Raven said, her voice steel. What? Someone has to ring it one last time. Raven didn't wait for an argument. She kicked the back door open, brandishing the dying flare like a weapon. The fog was lighter now, the sky turning a bruised purple in the east. The creatures were sluggish, retreating from the coming light. She sprinted, her combat boots pounded the mud. She ignored the shapes in the trees, the whispers in her ears. She reached the chapel. It was a slaughterhouse. Mark's body lay broken near the altar, and Brad was hanging from the bell rope, his body limp, his neck at a wrong angle. He had used his own weight to ring it, and the effort had killed him. But he hadn't had the strength for the final pull. Raven stared at the carnage, tears streaming down her face, cutting tracks through her makeup. She looked at Brad's body, swaying slightly. I'm sorry, she whispered. She leaped, grabbing Brad's legs. She pulled down with all her weight, adding her mass to his. The rope groaned, the mechanism creaked. C-L-Ang, 13. The sound was final. Absolute. A shockwave blasted outward from the chapel. The fog screamed as it was sucked back into the earth. The mud creatures dissolved into puddles of filth. The ghosts flickered and vanished like blown-out candles. The oppression lifted, leaving only the cold, damp morning air. Raven let go. She fell to the floor, gasping, surrounded by the bodies of her friends. She lay there until the first rays of sunlight cut through the shattered, stained glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was alive. Hours later, the police arrived. Jessica had found her way back to the road and flagged down a logging truck. Raven sat on the bumper of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket. She didn't speak. She couldn't explain what had happened. They blamed a gas leak, mass hallucinations, a psychotic break by Mark. The usual rationalizations. Raven walked over to the side mirror of the ambulance to wipe a smudge of dirt from her cheek. She looked into the glass. The sun was shining behind her. Birds were singing, but in the mirror, the sky was still dark. In the mirror, the fog was still swirling. And in the mirror, Raven wasn't moving. Her reflection stood perfectly still, staring back at her with eyes that were entirely black, a small, knowing smile playing on its lips. She blinked. The reflection didn't. Raven turned away, her blood running cold. She had survived the night, but she hadn't escaped. The 13th hour had claimed its toll. She got into the back of the police cruiser, the door locking with a heavy thud. Back at Miller's Gas and Go, Old Man Miller watched the police cruisers speed past, sirens wailing. He shook his head, lighting a cigarette with a trembling hand. A convertible pulled up to the pumps, filled with college kids in bright clothes, laughing, a surfboard in the back. Fill her up? Pops. The driver said, tossing keys in the air. We heard there's this creepy old camp around here. Thought we'd check it out. Miller looked at them. He looked at the rosary on the counter. He looked at the fog that still clung to the edges of the forest, waiting. It's closed, Miller said. Ah, come on. We heard it's a trip. Miller sighed, the smoke curling from his lips like a wraith. Suit yourself, he muttered, turning back to his cleaning. Some never learn. He watched them drive off, laughing toward the tree line. He gripped the rosary. Friday the 13th, he whispered to the empty room. Just another day. The neon sign buzzed, flickered, and for a moment went completely dark. The darkness that swallowed the neon sign at Miller's Gas and Go did not relinquish its hold. It did not flicker back to life. Instead, the blackness seemed to bleed outward from the dead glass tubing and ink spill in the air that defied the physics of light. Inside the station, Miller stood frozen. The cigarette in his hand hadn't just gone out, it had turned to gray dust that trickled through his paralyzed fingers. He stared out the window at the convertible of laughing college kids. They were frozen, too, suspended in time. The driver's hand was tossed in the air, keys hovering inches from his palm, glinting with a light source that no longer existed. Their laughter hung in the room, a looping, digital stutter, ha 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 ha. The sound warped, deepening, slowing down, until it wasn't laughter anymore. It was the grinding of heavy stones. The reality of the gas station began to peel. The linoleum floor curled up like burnt paper, revealing pulsating red muscle beneath. The shelves of motor oil and candy bars dissolved into sludge. Miller tried to scream, but his jaw was fused shut. He wasn't Miller anymore. He was just a prop, a cardboard cutout in a set that was being struck. Mills away in the back of the police cruiser, Raven blinked. The heavy thud of the door locking echoed in her mind, repeating with a rhythmic, wet cadence. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded suspiciously like a heartbeat. She stared at the back of the police officer's head through the wire mesh divider. The relief that had flooded her moments ago was beginning to curdle, turning into a cold, heavy grease in her stomach. Something was wrong. The vibration of the car against the road felt too smooth. There were no bumps, no friction of tires on asphalt. It felt like they were gliding. "Officer," she asked. Her voice sounded muffled, as if she were speaking through a mouthful of cotton. The officer didn't reply. He didn't move. His neck was stiff, the skin pale and waxy, possessing the sheen of a mannequin left too long in a shop window. Raven looked out the window. The trees were blurring past, a smear of green and brown. But as she focused, the blur slowed. The trees weren't passing by. They were stretching. The trunks were elongating, twisting like pulled taffy, wrapping around the car. And the sunlight, she pressed her hand against the cold glass. The sun was there, high in the sky, but it was flat. It had no corona, no warmth. It was a yellow circle painted on a gray canvas. And as she watched, a crack appeared in the center of the yellow disc. A black fluid began to ooze from the sun, dripping down the sky, dissolving the blue into nothingness. "Stop the car," Raven whispered. The radio cracked to life, but it wasn't a dispatcher. It was the sound of the bell, clang. The vibration rattled Raven's teeth. Clang. I said, "Stop the car." She hammered her fist against the divider. The officer's head slowly rotated, turned 180 degrees, the neck making a sound like dry branches snapping. There was no face, where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. There was only a smooth, featureless surface of wet clay. Embedded in the center of the clay was a single rusted hook. Raven screamed, scrambling backward, pressing herself against the locked door. The police cruiser began to dissolve. The leather seats melted into black tar that gripped her legs. The roof of the car softened, drooping down like melting wax, transforming into the canopy of ancient, rotting oaks. She wasn't in a car. She never had been. She was sitting in the mud, waist deep in the swamp, exactly where she had been before the bell rang the 13th time. The morning had been a lie. The rescue was a hallucination woven by the 13th hour to feed on her hope. The fall from that height of relief was more devastating than any physical blow. "No," she whimpered, clawing at the mud, trying to pull her legs free. "No, I got out. I saw the sun. Saw. The woods echoed back at her. The clearing was different now. The geography had shifted. The lake was no longer behind her. It was everywhere. A vast network of stagnant pools and islands of flesh-like moss. The chapel stood in the distance, but it had grown. It was now a cathedral of twisted bone and black timber, its spire piercing the low-hanging storm clouds that swirled with bruised purples and blacks. And the bell? The bell was still ringing, but not from the tower. The sound was coming from the ground beneath her. Raven freed one leg, the mud making a sucking sound as it released her boot. She scrambled up onto a root system that felt distressingly like a rib cage. "Jessica!" she screamed. Brad, to her left, the rusted hulk of the van, sat half submerged in the bog. It looked like it had been there for decades. Vines choked the chassis, the tires were gone. The back doors, which she had locked moments ago in her memory, were hanging off their hinges. Raven stumbled toward it, splashing through the oily water. "Jess?" She reached the van and looked inside. It was empty. No, not empty. The interior was lined with drawings, thousands of them, scratched into the metal, drawn in dirt, daubed in blood. Stick figures running, eyes watching, and the phrase repeated over and over in frantic, jagged script. "Time is a circle, time is a teeth." "Raven." The voice came from above. Raven spun around, looking up into the canopy. Suspended 20 feet in the air, wrapped in a cocoon of translucent spider silk and thorny vines, was Jessica. Her face was pressed against the membrane of the cocoon, distorted and terrified. "Help me." Jessica's voice was muffled, barely a squeak. "I'm coming." Raven scanned the area for a way up. The trees here were slick with slime, unclimbable. Then the water in the bog began to churn. Bubbles the size of basketballs rose to the surface and burst, releasing the stench of sulfur and old graves. The mud creature, the golem, rose again. But it had evolved. It was no longer just mud and weeds. It had incorporated the rescue into its form. The flashing lights of the police cruiser were embedded in its shoulders, flickering weakly under layers of muck. The siren wailed from somewhere deep inside its chest cavity, a mournful, dying electronic bleat. Shattered glass from the ambulance studded its forearms like diamonds. It didn't roar this time. It spoke with the voice of the dispatcher. 911, what is your emergency? The voice was distorted, slowed down, layered over the sound of drowning. Raven backed away, her hand fumbling for the flare she had used earlier. Her pocket was empty. She checked her belt. Her knife was there, a small serrated folding blade. Against a golem the size of a truck, it was a toothpick. "Think," she hissed to herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bell. The journal said the bell closes the door. We rang it 13 times. Why didn't it work? She looked toward the grotesque cathedral. The bell tower was empty. Brad's body was gone. He had used his own weight to ring it. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The ritual required a sacrifice, yes, but the 13th hour wasn't a clock time. It was a space. They hadn't closed the door. They had locked themselves inside the room. By ringing the bell 13 times, they had acknowledged the hour. They had accepted its logic. They had completed the summoning. The golem lunged. A massive arm, dripping with black sludge and tangled fishing nets, swept through the air. Raven dropped flat, the limb missing her head by inches. The wind of its passage smelled of ozone and rot. She rolled and scrambled into the thicket of thorns. The thorns tore at her jacket, biting into her skin, but the pain grounded her. It was unlike the police car, the pain was real. Unit 42, suspect, is resisting. The golem boomed, trudging after her. The ground shook with each step, the vibrations traveling up Raven's shins. She needed high ground. She needed to get to Jessica. Raven spotted a fallen tree that created a ramp up toward the lower branches of the canopy. She sprinted for it, her combat boots finding purchase on the rotting bark. She scrambled up the incline, slipping once, twice, her fingers digging into the wood to pull herself up. Below her, the golem smashed into the base of the fallen tree. The wood groaned and splintered. Raven lost her footing, sliding backward. She jammed her knife into the trunk, halting her slide just as the golem's hand clamped onto the wood where her foot had been a second ago. She pulled herself up, vaulting onto a thick branch. She was 15 feet up now, level with the lower tier of the cocoons. There were dozens of them. Jessica wasn't the only one. Raven squinted through the gloom. Inside the other cocoons were the others. The campers from the video, the kids from the convertible at the gas station, Old Man Miller. They were all hanging there in various states of preservation like trophies in a hunter's larder. Raven. Jessica screamed again. The cocoon she was trapped in was vibrating. Something was inside with her. Raven balanced on the branch, the wood slick with moss. Hold on. She leaped to the next branch, the gap terrifyingly wide. She caught it, swinging wildly. Her shoulders screaming in protest. She pulled herself up. She was close now. She reached Jessica's cocoon. Inside, Jessica was thrashing. A dark shape, no larger than a cat, but moving with insectile speed, was crawling over Jessica's legs inside the silk. Raven slashed at the membrane with her knife. It was tough, fibrous, like cutting through leather. Slit a tear opened. "Get out now," Raven yelled, reaching in. She grabbed Jessica's arm. The skin was freezing. Jessica tumbled out of the sack, gasping, covered in a clear, sticky gel. The dark shape inside the cocoon hissed. A cluster of spiders fused together into a single writhing mass and scuttled back into the shadows of the silk. Jessica clung to the branch, shivering violently. "We were in the car. We were safe? It wasn't real?" Raven said, gripping Jessica's shoulder hard. "Look at me. None of that was real. We are still here. We never left." Jessica looked down at the swamp floor. The golem was staring up at them, its police light shoulders strobing red and blue against the dark foliage. It raised a hand, and the mud of the forest floor began to rise with it. The trees around them groaned as their roots were manipulated by the entity's will. What do we do? Jessica sobbed. Riven looked at the cathedral in the distance. The geometry of it was all wrong. The angles hurt her eyes. It seemed to be pulling the entire forest toward it, a black hole of architecture. The bell didn't stop it because we played by its rules, Raven said, her mind racing. We tried to finish the ritual. We did what the journal said, but the journal was written by the man who created this. Why would he write the instructions on how to stop it? A trap. A recipe. Raven corrected. We weren't closing the door, we were cooking the meal. She looked at the golem, then back at the cathedral. We have to unring the bell, Raven said. That's impossible, Jessica stammered. You can't undo sound. In the real world? No, Raven said, wiping the sludge from her cheek. She looked at her reflection in the blade of her knife. Her eyes were dark, haunted, but they were her own. The reflection in the ambulance mirror had been the entity mocking her. But here, time is a circle. We saw it carved in the van. If time is a circle, we can go back. We have to destroy the bell. But Brad, Jessica's voice broke. If we break the cycle, Raven said, her voice softening, maybe we get him back, or maybe we just die for real. But hanging here like leftovers? She gestured to the cocoons around them. That's not an option. The tree they were standing on shuddered violently. The golem had begun to climb. It moved with unnatural grace for something so large, its body flowing around the trunk like a viscous landslide. Move, Raven commanded. They traversed the canopy, moving from branch to branch, deeper into the woods toward the cathedral. The air grew colder as they approached. The fog here wasn't white, it was a swirling gray dust, smelling of ash. As they landed on the dark earth near the cathedral grounds, the silence returned, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a held breath. The cathedral doors were open. A warm, golden light spilled out, the only warm light in this entire nightmare. It looked inviting. It looked like safety. Don't trust it, Raven whispered. They crept closer. Inside, the pews were filled. Raven froze. The pews were filled with people, hundreds of them. They sat perfectly still, facing the altar. They were dressed in clothes from different decades, 1970s camp counselors, 1990s hikers, a family in 1950s Sunday best. They were all statues, not stone, but salt. Pillars of salt, eroded by time, their features smoothed away. At the altar stood a figure. It wasn't the mud creature. It was a man in a pristine black suit. He had his back to them, reading from a large iron-bound book. And on the 13th toll, the man read, his voice smooth and cultured, echoing through the vaulted ceiling. The sheep shall construct their own pen. He turned around, it was Mark. But his eyes were gone, replaced by burning cinders, and his mouth was stitched shut with gold wire. The voice wasn't coming from his mouth. It was projecting directly into their skulls. Mark smiled, the wire tearing through his lips. Welcome back, ladies. You're just in time for the sermon. The salt statues in the pews all turned their heads in unison. The sound was like 1,000 grinding stones. Raven gripped her knife. Run for the tower, she whispered to Jessica. I'll distract you. Raven, no. Go. Raven shoved Jessica toward the side shadows and stepped into the center aisle, into the golden light. Mark, she shouted, her voice echoing in the vast, impossible space. Or whatever you are, you forgot something. The entity wearing Mark's skin tilted its head. And what is that, little fly? You can't trap someone who has nothing left to lose, Raven lied. She was terrified. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But she stepped forward, raising the knife. The floor beneath her feet shifted. The tiles weren't stone, they were teeth. Huge flat molars arranged in a grid. The cathedral was a mouth. Oh, Raven. The entity laughed, the sound vibrating in her marrow. You have so much left to lose, you haven't even begun to pay the toll. He raised a hand and the salt statue stood up. Raven braced herself. The nightmare had shed its disguise. There was no more police, no more mourning, no more hope of rescue. There was only the 13th hour, and she was standing in the center of the clock face. She charged. The floor possessed a sickening resilience. As Raven's boots slammed down, the sensation wasn't the jarring impact of stone, but the subtle, dense give of bone set in flesh. The tiles, those broad, flat molars, were slick with a thin film of viscous fluid that smelled faintly of digestive enzymes and myrrh. She skidded, her heel catching on a ridge of gum-like grout. The stumble was nearly fatal. To her left, a family of 4 in 1950s Sunday best lunged. They moved with a terrifying, jerky synchronization, their joints grinding audibly. The father figure swung a fist that was nothing more than a eroded stump of compacted salt. Raven ducked. The fist whistled over her head, the displacement of air stinging her eyes with grit. She drove her knife upward, aiming for where the armpit would be. The blade sank in with a dry crunch like stabbing a bag of gravel. There was no blood, only a puff of white dust that coated her hand and wrist. The vibration shuddered up her arm, numbing her ulnar nerve. She wrenched the blade free, twisting her body to kick the mother statue in the knee. The leg snapped with the sound of a pistol crack. The statue didn't scream. It merely tipped forward, its center of gravity lost, shattering across the enamel floor. The pieces didn't scatter like stone. They writhed for a moment, the salt crystals seeking to reform, vibrating with a magnetic hunger. Violence? The voice of the entity echoed, not from the altar, but from the vaulted ceiling, from the ribs of the architecture itself. Such a crude language. Is that all you have to offer the hour? Raven ignored the voice. She was a whirl of motion, a desperate animal trapped in a closing jaw. She wasn't trying to win, she was trying to be loud. She was trying to be the brightest, most irritating thing in the room, so the eye of the storm wouldn't look toward the shadows where Jessica was creeping. A group of hikers from the 90s blocked the center aisle. Their flannel shirts were calcified, stiff as armor. Their faces were smooth blanks, features erased by the relentless wind of the 13th hour, leaving only shallow indentations where eyes should be. Raven threw her shoulder into the nearest one. It was like tackling a boulder. The impact knocked the wind out of her, bruising her shoulder deep down to the bone. She gasped, tasting copper and brine. The statue stumbled back, its heavy boots scraping sparks against the toothed floor. She spun, slashing a backhand arc with her knife. The blade caught the neck of a teenager in a varsity jacket. The head didn't sever, it crumbled. A cascade of salt poured from the wound, burying Raven's boots in granular drifts. Keep moving, don't let them pin you. She scrambled over the back of a pew, which she realized now was carved from huge curved vertebrae, and landed in the next row. At the altar, the thing wearing Mark watched her with an air of bored benevolence. It hadn't moved, it stood amidst a circle of tall candles, but the flames were black, sucking light out of the room rather than casting it. The gold wire stitching its lips glinted. Do you fight the current? The entity projected the psychic weight of the words making Raven's nose bleed. A hot trickle ran down her philtrum, mixing with the salt dust on her lips. You think swimming harder will stop the drowning, but the water is already in your lungs, Raven. You inhaled the moment you read the inscription. Raven vaulted another pew, her breath coming in ragged hitches. She was halfway to the altar. "Shut up," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You're just a parasite." A bottom feeder in a fancy suit. The entity's cinder eyes flared brighter. The skin around Mark's temples began to smoke. Parasite. The entity raised a hand. The gravity in the cathedral shifted. It didn't flip, it tilted. Raven was suddenly fighting to stay upright on a 45-degree slope. The pews groaned, straining against their moorings. The salt statues, heavy and uncoordinated, began to slide. It was an avalanche of compressed humanity. Oh God, Raven gasped. Dozens of statues from the upper rows came tumbling down the incline. Limbs snapped off, heads shattered, torsos pulverized against the bone pews. The sound was deafening, a roar of grinding stone and snapping bone. Raven threw herself beneath the shelter of a pew just as the landslide hit. Bodies of salt slammed into the barrier of vertebrae above her. Dust choked the air, thick and white as a blizzard. She curled into a ball, covering her head as the weight of the congregation piled up against her shelter. Through the gaps in the bone bench, she saw the floor, the teeth begin to open. The molars were retracting. The gums were parting. Beneath the floor wasn't a basement, it was a throat. A red, wet, pulsating darkness that smelled of ancient rot and digestion. The sliding statues that failed to find purchase were falling into the gaps. Tumbling into the wet dark below, there were no screams, only the wet plop of heavy objects hitting deep water, or perhaps acid. Raven scrambled sideways, crawling along the length of the pew, fighting the tilt of the room. She needed to see the side aisle. She needed to know if Jessica had made it. She peered through the dust. The shadows by the eastern wall were undisturbed. The door to the bell tower, a narrow archway that looked like an ear canal, was open. Jessica was gone. She was inside, she made it. Now Raven just had to survive long enough for Jessica to climb. Is that it? Raven yelled, coughing up white dust. She hauled herself out from under the pew, grabbing the spine back to keep from sliding into the maw opening in the floor. You tip the board because you're losing. She looked up at the altar. The entity was unaffected by the shift in gravity. It stood perpendicular to the floor, defying physics, anchored by its own wrongness. Losing? The entity laughed, a sound like tearing canvas. I am merely chewing. The thing stepped down from the altar. As its foot left the dais, the illusion of Mark's body began to fail. The suit ripped at the seams, not because the body was growing, but because it was unfolding. Extra joints pushed against the fabric. The neck elongated, the skin stretching until it became translucent, revealing dark, ropey muscles underneath that writhed like eels. The wire stitches in the mouth snapped one by one, ping, 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 gold, flying like shrapnel. The jaw dropped open, unhinged. It hung impossibly low, resting on the chest. And from that gaping maw, a sound began to build. It wasn't a voice. It was the frequency of the bell. A low, resonant hum that vibrated the fillings in Raven's teeth and blurred her vision. Raven clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound was inside her. It was vibrating her bones. The entity lunged. It didn't run, it flowed. It crossed the distance between the altar and the pews in a blur of motion, leaping over the sliding wreckage of the salt statues. Raven let go of the pew. She slid. The floor was slick, and the tilt sent her rocketing down toward the opening chasms of the tooth floor. The entity slammed into the pew she had just vacated, its claws, long, serrated shards of bone, gouging deep gouges into the furniture. Raven steered her slide with her boots, aiming for a patch of floor that hadn't opened yet. She hit a molar the size of a manhole cover and scrambled for purchase. The gap to her right was widening, a pink abyss lined with cilia the size of seagrass. She looked up. The entity was perched on the pew above her, staring down with those burning cinder eyes. The skin of Mark's face was hanging in tatters, revealing a skull that was not human. It was elongated canine composed of black obsidian. The cycle ends when the meal is digested. The thing hissed, the voice now overlapping, Mark's tenor mixed with a grinding, subterranean bass. It prepared to pounce. Sklang. The sound was faint, muffled by stone and distance, but it cut through the chaos of the cathedral like a razor. A bell. Not the deep, resonant toll of the 13th hour. This was desperate, uneven. Someone was hitting the bronze with something hard. Clang, thud, clang, the entity froze. Its head snapped toward the tower door, the burning eyes narrowed. Interference, it snarled. Raven didn't hesitate. While the monster was distracted, she reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers brushed the flare gun she had taken from the ranger station supply box hours ago, back when she thought this was just a murder mystery. She hadn't used it because she feared it wouldn't work in this damp reality, or that the light would just feed the darkness. But she wasn't aiming for the darkness. She whipped the orange plastic gun out, braced it against her knee, and aimed not at the monster, but at the massive vaulted ceiling above them, specifically at the cluster of pendulous, sack-like chandeliers that hung directly over the altar. "Hey, ugly!" she screamed. The obsidian skull snapped back toward her. Raven pulled the trigger. The recoil kicked her hand back. A streak of magnesium bright red fire hissed through the air, trailing white smoke. It screamed upward, illuminating the upper reaches of the cathedral. The ceiling wasn't stone, it was flesh. A ribbed, soft pallet. The flare buried itself in the meat of the roof and exploded. The cathedral screamed. The entire room convulsed. The walls contracted. A rain of slime and debris fell from above as the living architecture recoiled from the burn. The chandeliers, which Raven now saw were actually suspended sacks of digestive acid, swayed violently, their connective tissue searing. One of the massive sacks tore loose. It fell, heavy and wet, plummeting straight toward the entity. The creature looked up, hissing, but the tilt of the floor and the convulsion of the room made dodging impossible. The sack hit the creature with a sickening wet slap, bursting on impact. A torrent of translucent yellow bile washed over the entity. It shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound, but a tear in the fabric of the air. The acid hissed, eating into the black obsidian and the tattered remains of Mark's suit. Smoke poured off its body. It thrashed, clawing at its own melting flesh, sliding uncontrollably down the tilted floor toward the throat chasm. Raven dug her knife into the gum grout, anchoring herself against the convulsions of the room. She watched as the creature wreathed in chemical steam, clawed frantically at the edge of the abyss. It locked eyes with her one last time. The hate in them was absolute, infinite. Then the floor shuddered again, a gag reflex, and the creature lost its grip. It tumbled backward into the dark, red throat. Raven didn't wait to see if it hit bottom. The room was trying to swallow itself. The teeth were grinding together. The pews were folding inward. She scrambled up the incline, hand over hand, using the knife as an ice axe. Her muscles burned, her lungs felt filled with glass, but the frantic, offbeat clanging of the bell in the tower gave her a rhythm to move to. Clang, scramble, clang, pull. She reached the side aisle. The floor here was flatter, though still heaving. She sprinted for the archway of the tower. She threw herself through the door just as the cathedral doors slammed shut with a boom that shook the fillings in her head. Silence. Sudden, ringing silence. Raven lay on the cold stone floor of the tower base. It was stone here, real cold, indifferent stone. Dust motes danced in a shaft of pale, gray light coming from a slit window. She rolled over, gasping. She checked her body. Bruises, cuts, covered in salt dust and slime, but whole. Above her, the spiral staircase wound upward into the gloom. Clang. Jessica was still up there. Raven pushed herself up. Her legs trembled, but they held. She wiped the slime from her face and began to climb. The stairs were tight, claustrophobic, the stone walls pressed in, but unlike the forest or the cathedral, this place felt old in a normal way. It felt like history, not nightmare. She climbed until her quads burned, spiraling up and up. Finally, she reached the belfry. It was an open-air platform, exposed to the swirling gray mist of the swamp. In the center hung the bell. It was enormous, iron and bronze, pitted with age, etched with symbols that hurt the eyes if looked at too closely. There was no clapper inside it. Jessica stood next to it, holding a heavy iron pry bar she must have found in the maintenance supplies. She looked wild, hair matted, face streaked with tears and grime. She was swinging the bar with everything she had, hitting the rim of the bell. C-A-L-ing. The sound was thin compared to the bell's potential, but it was disruptive. Jess. Raven called out. Jessica spun around, raising the bar defensively. When she saw Raven, she collapsed, dropping the bar. "You're alive," Jessica sobbed. "I heard the screaming. I thought I'm hard to digest." Raven said, moving to her side. She looked at the bell. "You're doing it. You're making noise." "It's not enough," Jessica said, wiping her nose. I can't break it. It's too solid. And the clapper is gone. We can't ring it backwards if we can't ring it properly." Raven approached the bell. She touched the cold metal. It hummed under her fingertips, a sleeping beast waiting to be woken. "We don't need to ring it," Raven said, looking at the symbols. The journal said unring. You can't unring a bell by hitting it. Then what? Raven looked out over the parapet. Below them, the swamp churned. The cathedral was shifting, contracting, looking less like a building and more like a crouching toad. The mist was gathering, forming shapes. The entity wasn't dead. It was just regrouping. "Sound is vibration," Raven murmured, her mind working furiously. "Time is a circle. To unring it, we have to stop the vibration. We have to dampen it permanently." She looked at the inside of the bell. It was hollow, a resonant chamber. The sacrifice, Raven said, a cold realization washing over her. The ritual demanded a sacrifice to open the door to close it, to fill the void. She looked at Jessica. Jessica looked back, eyes widening. "No," Jessica whispered. "Raven, no, not a person." Raven said quickly, though her heart hammered, "But something of value, something that resonates." She reached into her shirt and pulled out the silver locket she wore. It had been her mother's. It was the only thing she had left of the life before the foster system, before the streets. "This holds memory," Raven said. "It holds pain, just like this place. That's just a necklace." "Raven, it's not magic." "Everything is magic here, if you believe it enough." Raven said, "That's how this place works. It runs on belief and fear." "If I believe this is enough." She stepped inside the bell. The space was cramped. The smell of ozone was overpowering. "Raven, get out of there," Jessica yelled. The golem looked. Raven looked down. Climbing up the side of the tower, fingers digging into the mortar, was the entity. It was stripped of its disguise now. A flayed, obsidian skeleton wrapped in smoking, acidic slime. It moved with frantic, insectile speed. It was 30 feet down. 20, give me the pry bar, Raven shouted. Jessica hesitated, then kicked the iron bar across the floor. Raven grabbed it. She didn't strike the bell. She jammed the bar horizontally across the opening of the bell, wedging it against the inner rim. Then, she took her locket, wrapped the chain around the center of the bar, and let it hang in the center of the void where the clapper should be. We have to ground it, Raven said. Jessica, put your hands on the bell, stop the vibration. What? Touch it. Will it to be silent, pour every ounce of I want to go home into the metal. The obsidian hand slammed onto the parapet ledge. The creature pulled itself up, its skull shrieking, its empty eye sockets fixing on them. Do it! Raven screamed. Jessica lunged forward, slamming both palms against the cold bronze. She squeezed her eyes shut. Quiet. Be quiet. I want to go home. Raven grabbed the other side of the bell. She focused on the locket hanging inside, the symbol of her past, her grief. She visualized the silence of a grave, the silence of a snowy morning, absolute heavy silence. The creature vaulted over the railing. It raised a claw to strike. The toll must be paid. It roared, Raven, and Jessica screamed, not with their voices but with their wills. They pushed the silence into the metal. The locket began to glow, a soft blue light. The creature froze mid-strike. The bell didn't ring. Instead, it inhaled a vacuum of sound, the thunder of the storm, the roar of the creature, the beating of their own hearts. It was all sucked into the bronze cavity, the air distorted, the symbols on the bell flared white-hot. The creature shrieked, but no sound came out. It was being pulled. The vacuum was stronger than gravity. The obsidian bones began to crack, turning to dust, the dust spiraling into the mouth of the bell. Don't let go, Raven yelled, though she couldn't hear herself. The metal was freezing under her hands, sucking the heat from her body. Frost raced up her arms. The creature disintegrated, its form unspooled like black yarn, drawn inexorably into the bell, into the silence. The tower began to shake. The stone floor cracked. The world outside the belfry was dissolving, the trees turning to ink, the sky turning to static. The silence grew louder. It was a pressure building behind Raven's eyes. She looked at Jessica. Jessica was pale. Her lips blue, her eyes rolled back. She was fading. Jess? Raven let go of the bell with one hand and grabbed Jessica's wrist. The world went white. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was rhythmic, annoying. Raven gasped, her body arching off the mattress. Pain flooded her senses, sharp, medicinal, real. Whoa, easy, hold her down. Strong hands pushed her shoulders back. Raven blinked, her vision swimming white tiles. Fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. She was in a hospital room. A nurse was adjusting an IV line. A doctor was shining a penlight in her eyes. She's back with us, the doctor said. Pupils are responsive. Raven tried to speak, but her throat felt like she'd swallowed sandpaper. Jess, she croaked, your friend is in the next bed. The nurse said softly, nodding to the left. A Raven turned her head. Jessica was there, hooked up to monitors, sleeping. Her face was scratched, bruised, but pink with life. You two are lucky, a voice said from the doorway. Raven looked over. A police officer stood there. A real one, not a mud golem. He looked tired, holding a clipboard. Found you two in the wreckage of that old church off Route 9, the officer said. Nasty collapse, roof came down. Forensics said there was a gas leak, hallucinogenic molds or something in the old timber. Explains why you were both raving when the paramedics pulled you out. Raven stared at him. Gas leak. Yeah, the officer said, and I'm sorry to tell you this, but we found the other boy. Brad, he didn't make it out of the basement. Looks like the floor gave way. Raven closed her eyes. The grief was heavy, but it was a dull human ache, not the sharp, tearing horror of the 13th hour. Rest up, the officer said. We'll need statements when you're stronger. He left. The doctor and nurse finished their checks and stepped out, dimming the lights. The room was quiet. Raven lay there listening to the beep of the heart monitor. It was a good sound, a clock sound. She reached up to her neck. Her hand brushed bare skin. The locket was gone. She froze. She patted the bedside table. Nothing. Nurse, she rasped. The nurse popped her head back in. Yes, honey, my necklace. A silver locket. Did I have it? The nurse frowned. No, sweetie. You didn't have any jewelry on you when you came in. Just the clothes on your back. Raven sank back into the pillow. She stared at the ceiling. It was gone, left behind in the bell, the price of the toll. She looked over at Jessica. Jessica's eyes were open, staring at her. They were dark, terrified. Raven. Jessica whispered, "It's okay." Raven said, "We're out. It was just a gas leak." Just a nightmare. Jessica slowly raised her hand. She pointed a trembling finger at the wall clock. Raven looked. It was a standard hospital clock. Black hands, white face. The second hand was ticking tick, tick, tick. But then it hitched. It moved backward for a second, tock, then forward again. And in the reflection of the glass face of the clock, Raven saw it, standing in the corner of the hospital room, just on the edge of the shadows. A figure in a pristine black suit, its mouth stitched shut with gold wire. It raised a finger to its lips. Shh. Raven's heart monitor began to speed up. Beep, beep, beep. The figure winked, and then as a cloud passed over the moon outside, plunging the room into momentary darkness, the figure dissolved into salt. The clock continued to tick, but Raven knew, with a sinking dread that went deeper than her bones, that the door wasn't locked. It was just pushed shut, and the 13th hour was patient. The rapid beep, 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 beep of the heart monitor spiraled into a frantic, singular whine. The door burst open. Light flooded the room, harsh and invasive, banishing the shadows to the edges of the linoleum. BP is spiking. She's tachycardia. The nurse from before was back, accompanied by a burly orderly. They descended on Raven like white-clad vultures. Raven thrashed, her limbs heavy and uncooperative, her mind still reeling from the image of the stitched man dissolving into granules. "Get off me," Raven gasped, but the words were slurry, lost in the plastic mask they were pressing over her face. He was there? It's just the shock, honey. Breathe. The nurse commanded, her voice a practiced melody of forced calm. "You're having a panic attack. Deep breaths. In, out." Raven felt the prick of a needle in her IV port. A cold sensation, not unlike the freezing bronze of the bell, slid up her vein. The edges of her vision blurred. The panic didn't leave, but her body's ability to express it was chemically severed. Her muscles went slack against the starch-stiff sheets. "There," the nurse said, smoothing Raven's hair back with a hand that felt too hot, too dry. "Just a bad dream. The sedatives will help you sleep without dreaming this time." Without dreaming, that was the most terrifying threat she could have made. The medical staff lingered, checking the monitors, adjusting the drip, whispering in low tones about post-traumatic stress and hallucinations from toxin exposure. They spoke about Raven and Jessica as if they were broken appliances, objects to be calibrated. Finally, the door hissed shut. The room plunged back into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the sickly green glow of the vital screen and the amber street lights bleeding through the blinds. Raven lay paralyzed by the sedative, but her eyes refused to close. She stared at the corner where the entity had stood. "Raven?" The whisper was barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Raven turned her head slowly. The movement felt like dragging a stone through mud. Jessica was propped up on one elbow, her face a pale mask of sweat and terror. She was staring at the same corner. "I saw him too," Jessica whispered. Her voice trembled, brittle as dried leaves. "The salt, I saw him turn to salt." Raven fought the drug weighing down her tongue. "They said gas leak." "Wasn't gas," Jessica said, tears welling in her eyes. "Brad didn't die from a floor collapse. I heard him scream, Raven, before the roof came down." "I heard him scream my name?" Raven squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of nausea. The chemical calm in her blood was warring with the adrenaline of truth. "We paid the toll," she murmured. The locket, the silence, it stopped. "Did it?" Jessica asked. She pointed a shaking finger toward the window. "Listen." Raven strained her ears. She heard the distant wail of a siren. She heard the rattle of a cart in the hallway, and then she heard it. It was faint, rhythmic, a low thrumming vibration that seemed to come not from the air, but from the building's skeleton. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was a breathing sound, a deep tectonic respiration, as if the hospital itself were inhaling and exhaling. "Hoo hoo hoo hoo." The vibration, Raven whispered. "It's dampened, but it's not gone." She forced herself to sit up. The room spun violently. The floor tilted like the deck of a ship in a storm, then righted itself. She ripped the tape off her hand, wincing as she pulled the IV needle out. A bead of dark blood welled up, looking black in the dim light. "Raven, what are you doing?" Jessica hissed. "If the nurse comes back, I need to see," Raven said. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet hit the cold tile. The cold was shocking. It traveled up her shins, settling in her knees. She grabbed the IV pole for support, the metal rattling. She shuffled toward the corner. The space between the beds felt miles wide. Her hospital gown was thin, offering no protection against the chill that seemed to radiate from the walls. She reached the corner. The shadows here were thick, pooling like oil. Raven knelt, her knees cracking. She squinted at the floor. There, caught in the textured grooves of the hospital tile, was a dusting of white. It looked like common table salt, or perhaps sugar. But as Raven reached out a trembling finger to touch it, the granules seemed to vibrate, skittering away from her skin like magnets repelling. She trapped a pinch of it between her thumb and forefinger. It was coarse, sharp. She brought it to her nose. It didn't smell like salt. It smelled like sulfur and old, wet copper. It smelled like the interior of the bell. "Is it there?" Jessica asked from the bed. Raven nodded, wiping her hand on her gown. "It's real. He was here. He marking us?" "Why?" "Because we cheated," Raven said, the realization settling in her gut like a stone. She used the wall to pull herself back up. "We forced the door shut. We didn't solve the riddle. We broke the lock. The stitched man, he's the caretaker. We made a mess." She looked at the clock again. The second hand was moving normally now, sweeping past the 12. But the reflection in the glass had changed. Raven leaned closer. The glass covering the clock face acted as a dark mirror for the room behind her. In the reflection, the hospital beds were there. Jessica was there. But the window... In the reflection, the window blinds were gone. Outside, there was no city, no amber streetlights. In the reflection, the window looked out onto a churning gray mist, and rising from the mist, huge and impossible, was the silhouette of the cathedral tower. Raven spun around to look at the real window, blinds, streetlights, a car driving past. Reality, she looked back at the clock, missed the tower. The nightmare, we're straddling it. Raven whispered, a new horror dawning on her. "We're not fully out. We're like radio stations bleeding into each other. Static." She stumbled back to Jessica's bed. Jessica grabbed her hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by panic. "What do we do?" Jessica asked. "We can't tell the police. We can't tell the doctors. They'll lock us in the psych ward. And if we're locked in..." Finally, the door hissed shut. The room plunged back into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the sickly green glow of the vital screen and the amber streetlights bleeding through the blinds. Raven lay paralyzed by the sedative, but her eyes refused to close. She stared at the corner where the entity had stood. "Raven?" The whisper was barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Raven turned her head slowly. The movement felt like dragging a stone through mud. Jessica was propped up on one elbow, her face a pale mask of sweat and terror. She was staring at the same corner. "I saw him too," Jessica whispered. Her voice trembled, brittle as dried leaves. "The salt, I saw him turn to salt." Raven fought the drug weighing down her tongue. "They said gas leak." "It wasn't gas," Jessica said, tears welling in her eyes. "Brad didn't die from a floor collapse. I heard him scream, Raven, before the roof came down. I heard him scream my name." Raven squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the wave of nausea. The chemical calm in her blood was warring with the adrenaline of truth. "We paid the toll," she murmured. The locket, the silence. It stopped. "Did it?" Jessica asked. She pointed a shaking finger toward the window. "Listen." Raven strained her ears. She heard the distant wail of a siren. She heard the rattle of a cart in the hallway, and then she heard it. It was faint, rhythmic. A low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come not from the air, but from the building's skeleton. It wasn't a mechanical sound, it was a breathing sound, a deep tectonic respiration, as if the hospital itself were inhaling and exhaling. "Ho ho ho, ho ho," the vibration, Raven whispered. "It's dampened, but it's not gone." She forced herself to sit up. The room spun violently. The floor tilted like the deck of a ship in a storm, then righted itself. She ripped the tape off her hand, wincing as she pulled the IV needle out. A bead of dark blood welled up, looking black in the dim light. "Raven, what are you doing?" Jessica hissed. "If the nurse comes back, I need to see," Raven said. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet hit the cold tile. The cold was shocking. It traveled up her shins, settling in her knees. She grabbed the IV pole for support, the metal rattling. She shuffled toward the corner. The space between the beds felt miles wide. Her hospital gown was thin, offering no protection against the chill that seemed to radiate from the walls. She reached the corner. The shadows here were thick, pooling like oil. Raven knelt, her knees cracking. She squinted at the floor. There, caught in the textured grooves of the hospital tile, was a dusting of white. It looked like common table salt, or perhaps sugar. But as Raven reached out a trembling finger to touch it, the granules seemed to vibrate, skittering away from her skin like magnets repelling. She trapped a pinch of it between her thumb and forefinger. It was coarse, sharp. She brought it to her nose. It didn't smell like salt. It smelled like sulfur and old wet copper. It smelled like the interior of the bell. "Is it there?" Jessica asked from the bed. Raven nodded, wiping her hand on her gown. "It's real. He was here. He's marking us. Why? Because we cheated," Raven said, the realization settling in her gut like a stone. She used the wall to pull herself back up. "We forced the door shut. We didn't solve the riddle. We broke the lock. The stitched man, he's the caretaker. We made a mess." She looked at the clock again. The second hand was moving normally now, sweeping past the 12, but the reflection in the glass had changed. Raven leaned closer. The glass covering the clock face acted as a dark mirror for the room behind her. In the reflection, the hospital beds were there. Jessica was there, but in the reflection, the window blinds were gone. Outside there was no city, no amber streetlights. In the reflection, the window looked out onto a churning gray mist, and rising from the mist, huge and impossible, was the silhouette of the cathedral tower. Raven spun around to look at the real window. Blinds, streetlights. A car driving past. Reality? She looked back at the clock. Mist, the tower, the nightmare were straddling it. Raven whispered, a new horror dawning on her. "We're not fully out. We're like radio stations bleeding into each other, static." She stumbled back to Jessica's bed. Jessica grabbed her hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by panic. "What do we do?" Jessica asked. "We can't tell the police. We can't tell the doctors. They'll lock us in the psych ward. And if we're locked in? Then we're trapped with them." Raven finished. "If they sedate us again, we might not wake up here. We might wake up back in the belfry." Raven looked at the door. Through the small rectangular window, she saw the nurse walking past. But for a split second, the nurse's shadow on the wall didn't match her movement. The shadow lagged behind, elongating, growing spindly fingers that dragged along the floor. "We have to leave," Raven said. "Now." "I can't walk," Jessica said, pulling back the sheet. Her right leg was heavily bandaged, splinted from ankle to knee. "They said I tore ligaments when we fell." Raven looked at the injury, then at the wheelchair folded in the corner of the room. "You don't have to walk," Raven said. She went to the wheelchair and unfolded it. It locked with a loud clack that made them both flinch. "I'm getting you out of here." "Raven, you can barely stand?" "I've walked on worse." Raven lied. The pain in her head was a rhythmic thudding, synchronizing with the breathing of the building. Get in? It took 5 agonizing minutes to transfer Jessica from the bed to the chair. Every movement was a gamble against the monitors. Raven had disconnected Jessica's sensors carefully, leaving the leads bundled under the pillow to mimic a faint, erratic signal. A trick she'd learned in a foster home to sneak out at night. Raven threw a blanket over Jessica's lap. She grabbed her own clothes from the plastic bag on the bedside table, torn jeans, a flannel shirt stiff with dried mud and swamp water. She changed quickly, wincing as the fabric scraped against the frostbite burns on her arms. The burns were strange. They weren't red or blistered. They were silver, like veins of mercury running beneath her skin. They didn't hurt when she touched them. They felt numb, absent. "Ready?" Raven whispered. Jessica nodded, gripping the armrests of the chair until her knuckles turned white. Raven cracked the door. The hallway was quiet. The nurse's station was 50 feet down to the right. The nurse was typing on a computer, her back to them. Raven pushed the wheelchair out. The rubber wheels squeaked on the linoleum. "Squeak," squeaked to Raven. The sound was deafening. It sounded like the rats in the cathedral crypt. They moved toward the elevators on the left, past the linen closet, past the janitor's closet. As they passed room 304, the door was wide open, the room was empty, the bed stripped. But as Raven pushed the chair past, she felt a draft, a freezing wind blowing out of the room. She glanced inside. Standing in the center of the empty room, facing away from the door, was a boy. He was wearing a muddy varsity jacket. Raven stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Brad," she whispered. The boy didn't turn, but he raised a hand and pointed toward the ceiling. "Raven, come on," Jessica hissed. tugging on Raven's sleeve. She hadn't seen him. Raven blinked. The room was empty again, just a stripped mattress and moonlight. Yeah, Raven breathed. Yeah, going. She hit the call button for the elevator. The light didn't turn on. She hit it again. Nothing. Stairs? Raven said, "We have to take the stairs." "I'm in a wheelchair, Raven. It's a fire door. There's a ramp on the landing for the next floor down." Then we figure it out. They moved to the heavy door marked exit. Raven put her shoulder into it. It was heavy, pressurized. She shoved, gritting her teeth, the silver veins in her arms throbbing with a sudden cold ache. The door swung open. But instead of the sterile concrete of a hospital stairwell, they were met with a wall of humid, rot-scented air. The stairs were there, but they were overgrown. Vines, thick and black like arterial veins, pulsed along the handrails. The concrete steps were slick with moss. The fluorescent light above flickered, buzzing with the sound of 1,000 cicadas. "Oh, God," Jessica whimpered. "Don't look at the walls," Raven ordered, turning the wheelchair around to back it down the first step. "Just look at me. Keep your eyes on me. It's back." Jessica sobbed. "We never left." "We left," Raven grunted, straining to hold the weight of the chair as she lowered it down one step. "Thump. This is just leakage. Echoes. We are in the hospital. This is just an overlay. How do you know?" "Because," Raven grunted, lowering it another step. "Thump. If we were back there, that moss would be trying to eat us. Right now, it's just watching." She navigated the chair down the flight of stairs, sweat stinging her eyes. The air in the stairwell was suffocating. It smelled of formaldehyde and swamp gas. They reached the landing. Raven spun the chair around. The door to the second floor, the maternity ward, according to the sign, was blocked. Not locked, blocked. Thick, gray webbing was plastered across the doorframe. It looked like spider silk, but wet and fleshy. Embedded in the webbing were objects: a plastic rattle, a pacifier, a silver wristwatch, a stethoscope. "Trophies," Raven whispered. "We have to go down to the lobby," Jessica said, her voice rising in panic. "Keep going down. Wait." Raven stepped closer to the webbing in the center of the mass. Pulsating with a faint blue light was something familiar. It was her locket. It wasn't gone. It wasn't left in the bell. It was here. Caught in the barrier between floors. "It followed me," Raven said softly. She reached out. "Don't touch it," Jessica screamed. Raven's fingers brushed the silver. Instantly the world lurched. The stairwell vanished. The hospital vanished. For a heartbeat, Raven was standing on a vast, flat plain of gray ash. The sky was a bruised purple, devoid of stars. In the distance, a colossal bell hung suspended in the sky. No tower to support it, just hanging in the void. And beneath the bell, thousands of figures stood in silence. They were made of salt. They were all looking at her. Then, with a snap like a rubber band breaking, the vision collapsed. Raven was back on the landing. The webbing was gone. The door to the second floor was just a metal door. The locket was gone. But in her hand, she was clutching something. She opened her fist. It was a piece of paper, old yellowed parchment, folded into a tight square. Raven unfolded it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. It was a page torn from a hymnal, but the lyrics had been scratched out with black ink. Scrawled over the notes, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like Raven's own, were 3 words: "Find the sexton." "Raven?" Jessica was staring at her, terrified. You flickered, like a bad hologram." Raven shoved the paper into her pocket. The cold in her arms was spreading to her chest. "We need to get out of the stairwell," Raven said, her voice hard. "The sexton, whoever that is, or whatever that is, it's the next key. I want to go home," Jessica wept. "We are going home," Raven said, grabbing the handles of the wheelchair. "But I think we have to take the long way around." She pushed the door open. The second floor was dark. The power was out here. But down the long shadowed corridor of the maternity ward, the nursery viewing window was glowing with a soft, impossible blue light. And from within the nursery, the music box melody of Frère Jacques began to play. Slow, distorted. "Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping?" Raven didn't hesitate. She turned the wheelchair to the right away from the nursery and broke into a run. The rubber wheels of the wheelchair didn't just squeak, they shrieked, a high-pitched friction that tore through the heavy silence of the maternity ward. Raven pushed harder, her boots slipping on linoleum that felt increasingly slick, as if a layer of oil or condensation had settled over the wax. The blue light from the nursery wasn't staying put. As Raven glanced back, she saw the glow spilling into the hallway like pressurized water bursting from a dam. It crept along the floorboards, a phosphorescent fog that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. But the dust wasn't moving randomly, it was swirling, organizing into shapes. Tiny grasping hands. Faster, Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. It's getting louder. The music box melody had slowed to a funereal tempo, the notes grinding against each other like rusted gears. Are you sleeping? I'm trying. Raven gritted out. The exertion was making the silver veins in her arms burn with a paradoxical freeze. It felt as though liquid nitrogen were being pumped through her radial arteries, chilling her blood before it could reach her heart. They passed a station of incubators that had been lined up against the wall, presumably for storage or cleaning. In the flashing strobe of a dying overhead light, Raven saw the plastic cases were not empty. They were filled with black water. And floating in the murky fluid of the nearest one wasn't an infant, but a large rough-hewn stone. A cobblestone, it bobbed gently, tethered by an umbilical cord that vanished into the dark drain at the bottom of the tank. Don't look left, Raven commanded, forcing her gaze straight ahead. I hear wet feet, Jessica whimpered. Raven, I hear wet feet slapping the floor behind us. Echoes, Raven lied again. Just echoes, but she heard it too. Slap, slap. Slap? A wet, frantic rhythm that was outpacing the wheelchair. It sounded like a child running through puddles, but the puddles were made of meat. The corridor seemed to stretch, the perspective warping. The doors to the patient rooms on either side were closed, but the small windows were lit from within, not by hospital lights, but by candles. Hundreds of flickering orange lights visible through the reinforced glass. Shadows danced on the blinds, tall, elongated figures bending over beds, raising implements that looked like scythes or surgical saws. Where are the stairs? Jessica cried out. We passed the nurse's station. The layout is changing, Raven said, her breath hitching. The building is remembering what it used to be. It was never a church. It's a hospital. Before the hospital, Raven said, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The land, the foundation. It's all the same bruise. Ahead, the corridor finally terminated at a T-junction. To the left, the sign pointed to NICU. To the right, elevators, Chappelle, morgue access. Raven banked the chair hard to the right. The centrifugal force nearly tipped Jessica out, but the injured girl slammed her hand against the wall to steady herself, leaving a bloody smear on the beige paint. Sorry, Raven gasped. Just go. They rounded the corner, and the blue light from the nursery finally faded, swallowed by the oppressive gloom of this new wing. But the air here was different. It didn't smell of rot or swamp anymore. It smelled of incense and formaldehyde. A cloying, sweet chemical scent that coated the back of the throat. The floor here was tiled in a black and white checkerboard pattern that hurt the eyes. The walls were lined with portraits of hospital benefactors, old men in suits, but as Raven pushed the chair past them, the faces seemed to have been scratched out, replaced by crude drawings of bells. The sexton, Raven muttered, the note in her pocket feeling heavy like a lead weight. A sexton takes care of the church property. They ring the bells, they dig the graves. Why does that matter? Jessica asked, clutching the blanket to her chest. Because if we're in the nightmare, we have to play by the nightmare's logic. We can't just walk out the front door. We have to find the key. Raven scanned the signs. The sexton would be near the dead or the holy ground. The morgue is in the basement, Jessica said. Please don't say we have to go to the basement. Not yet, Raven said. She spotted a set of double oak doors halfway down the hall. They stood out violently against the clinical surroundings. Intricate carvings of weeping angels adorned the wood, their faces buried in their hands. Above the door, a modest plastic sign read, Interfaith Chappelle, there, Raven said. That's a trap, Jessica said immediately. It looks like a coffin, Raven. It's a threshold. The webbing on the stairs, it was a barrier. This looks like a bridge. The sound of wet footsteps behind them grew louder. Slap, 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 closer now, fast. Raven didn't wait for Jessica to argue. She shoved the wheelchair toward the oak doors. She let go of the handles at the last second, threw her shoulder into the wood, and the doors gave way with a heavy, pressurized hiss. She grabbed the chair again and shoved Jessica inside, diving in after her and kicking the doors shut. She slammed the deadbolt home just as something slammed into the other side. Thud. The wood groaned. The weeping angels on the carving seemed to shudder. Thud. Open up, a small gurgling voice called from the hallway. It sounded like a child speaking through a mouthful of water. Time for your medicine. Raven backed away from the door, her chest heaving. It can't get in. Sanctuary rules? You're making that up, Jessica whispered, tears streaming down her face. I have to believe it, or we're dead. Raven turned to look at the room they had entered. It was the hospital chapel, but it had been stretched vertically. The ceiling was impossibly high, vanishing into a gloom where faint, dusty rafters crisscrossed like spider legs. The rows of modest, padded chairs usually found in hospital chapels were gone. Instead, there were wooden pews, ancient and worm-eaten, stained black with age. At the front of the room, there was no altar. There was a medical gurney draped in purple velvet, and behind the gurney, where a cross or a Star of David should have been, was a stained glass window. But it didn't look outside. It was backlit by a churning, feverish red light, depicting a scene of a great tower crumbling into a sea of eyes. Is this... Jessica's voice died in her throat. It's the belfry, Raven said softly, or the memory of it. She walked slowly down the center aisle. The silence here was heavy, pressurized. It pressed against her ears. The cold in her veins pulsed in time with the throbbing red light behind the glass. On the velvet-draped gurney lay a book. It was massive, bound in pale, cracked leather that looked suspiciously like skin. Raven approached it. Jessica wheeled herself slowly behind, afraid to be left near the door where the wet thing was still scratching. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Raven reached out to the book. Her silver-veined hand hovered over the cover. There was no title, just a symbol burned into the leather, a circle with a crack running through it, a broken bell. Find the sexton, she whispered. She opened the book. It wasn't a Bible. It was a ledger. The pages were filled with names, dates, and times. Thousands of them, written in cramped, frantic handwriting. Sarah Miller, 2:03 a.m., consumed. David Chen, 4:15 a.m., rejected. Emily Vance, 11:50 p.m., integrated. Raven flipped the pages, her heart hammering. The dates went back decades, centuries. Long before the hospital was built, Raven, Jessica whispered. Look at the last entry. Raven looked to the bottom of the open page. The ink was still wet. It glistened black in the red light. Jessica Thorne pending. Raven Darkholm returned, Raven read aloud. The word tasted like ash. Suddenly, a sound came from the shadows in the corner of the chapel to the right of the stained glass. It was the sound of metal scraping on stone. Shh, shh, shh. Raven spun around, placing herself between the noise and Jessica. A small door, almost hidden in the wainscoting, creaked open. It was a door for a priest or a janitor. A figure emerged. He was tall, impossibly gaunt, wearing the gray jumpsuit of a hospital janitor. But over it, he wore a tattered, moth-eaten stole embroidered with silver thread. His face was hidden behind a surgical mask that was stained yellow, and he wore thick, rubber autopsy gloves. In one hand, he held a mop, in the other, a heavy iron key ring that jangled with the sound of wind chimes. He didn't look at them. He looked at the floor where a small puddle of water had dripped from the ceiling. He began to mop it up with slow, methodical strokes. The sexton? Raven asked, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her gut. The figure stopped mopping. He slowly raised his head. His eyes were milky white, cataracts covering the pupils entirely. The service is over, the man rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Visiting hours are concluded, we're not visitors, Raven said, taking a step forward. She pulled the crumpled hymnal page from her pocket and held it up. I found this. It says to find you. The sexton stared at the paper with his blind eyes. He tilted his head like a bird listening for a worm underground. Ah, he sighed. The choir, they are always recruiting. He clipped the mop into the bucket and stepped forward, the keys jangling. You carry the mark, child. The silver rivers. He pointed a gloved finger at Raven's arms. The bell kissed you, and you didn't shatter. Rare, very rare. Where is the exit? Raven demanded. How do we get out of the overlay? Out? The sexton chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. There is no out, child. There's only down or up. The hospital is just the skin. The cathedral is the bone. You cannot leave your own bones. We left the belfry, Jessica said, her voice rising. We woke up. You woke up in the waiting room. The sexton corrected, gesturing around the chapel. This whole place, the machines, the doctors, the medicine. It is just the waiting room for the final service. He turned and walked toward the small door he had entered from. If you wish to file a complaint, he said over his shoulder, you must speak to the administrator. He is in the basement. In the deep morgue, the basement. Raven said, a cold dread settling in her stomach. The elevator is broken, the sexton said, pausing at the door. The shaft is clogged with debris. You must take the dumbwaiter. Behind the altar. He pointed to the stained glass window, but be warned. The sexton added, his voice dropping to a whisper. The dumbwaiter passes through the kitchens, and the cooks are very hungry. Wait. Raven stepped forward. Who are you? Why are you helping us? The sexton looked back. For a second, the surgical mask seemed to bulge, as if something underneath it was smiling a too wide smile. I'm the one who cleans up the mess, he said. And you, little bell ringer, are going to make a magnificent mess. He stepped through the small door and slammed it shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Raven stood frozen for a moment, then turned to the stained glass window. Behind the altar, she muttered. She moved to the gurney and shoved it aside. The wheels squealed. Behind the velvet drapes, set into the stone wall beneath the window, was a small stainless steel hatch,
of rancid meat
about 3 feet by
copper.
3 feet. A single frayed rope hung in the center.
Laundry.
We can't fit in that, Jessica said, looking at the small box. Raven, the wheelchair won't fit. Raven looked at the shaft, then at Jessica's splinted leg. Then she looked back at the main doors of the chapel. The scratching had stopped, but now a liquid was seeping under the door. A thick black fluid, it was bubbling. We don't have a choice, Raven said. She turned to Jessica. We leave the chair, I carry you. You can't. Your arms? My arms are numb, Raven said. I can't feel the pain anymore. That's a good thing right now. She knelt down, climbed on my back. We have to slide down the ropes. If the sexton is right, the kitchen is below us, and below that, the deep morgue. Jessica hesitated, terrified, but the black liquid was spreading fast, sizzling where it touched the legs of the pews. Jessica wrapped her arms around Raven's neck. Raven grunted as she stood, the weight settling onto her spine. The silver veins in her arms pulsed violently, glowing bright enough to illuminate the inside of the dumbwaiter shaft. Hold on tight, Raven whispered, and whatever you hear in the walls, don't scream. She stepped into the metal box, grabbed the greasy rope with her glowing hand, and kicked the brake release. They dropped into the dark,